So as Toby was saying, we're starting this new series today, and we call it The Influencer. Right. It's about the book of Esther, because Esther, not many biblical scholars know this, but she had a very active Instagram account. That's why we call it. No, that's not why she's called the influencer. We want to learn from her how to actually influence change. And I think we can learn so much from her. It's a book in the Old Testament. If you have your Bibles, you have some time now to look it up, actually. I'll give you a little bit of a start. It's in the first half of the Bible, just before the Psalms, just before Job. There's a short book called the Book of Esther, if you want to open it up. And it's really a fascinating, an ancient story that has everything that you need in order to have an amazing story. There are power struggles, there are assassination plots, there's greed, there's sex, there are whistleblowers, there's coming outs, there's drunken orgies, everything that you want from a good story, it's all there. Guys, you're gonna love this story, and I hope you can be here for the next weeks as we go through this series. Maybe you're asking this question though, it's like, hey, this story is an old story. It's actually 2,500 years old since this happened, and you might be wondering, okay, why are we looking at this in 2022 in Berlin? Because my life is very different than this ancient hero character called Esther. What do I have in common with her? Let me actually just kind of, as a little teaser, here's some of the topics that we will come across. First of all, it is a story of influence. That's why we call the series The Influencer. Here is a Jewish orphan girl who becomes the vehicle of social justice in a very male-dominated society. So if she manages to do this, I want to know how. Because maybe you also feel like my voice is powerless. What can I do? We can learn from Esther how your voice can have power. It's not just a story of influence, it's also a story of integrity. Integrity in the sense of that the Jewish people at that time, they were a religious minority in the kingdom of Persia. So this isn't happening in Israel, it's happening in the kingdom of Persia at a time where they were the religious minority and everybody else had a different belief system, different values, and maybe that's how you also feel sometime. Maybe as you're trying to follow Jesus in the city of Berlin and you're like, how do I navigate this? How am I true to my values and my beliefs and what's important to me in a city where everybody else disagrees? Everybody has a different worldview. Do I fight this? Do I protest it? Do I withdraw? Do I try to blend in? Like, how do I navigate this? We can learn a lot from Esther on how to have integrity in a city that's largely different to our beliefs. Thirdly, it's not just a story of influence and of integrity, it's also a story of the invisibleness of God. The invisibleness of God, because here's what's very interesting. In the book of Esther, there is no mention of God in any verse. It's the only book in the Bible, apart from the Song of Songs, which is poetry, where God is not even mentioned. It's as if he's not even there. It's not even that he's not even mentioned indirectly, that you would read about a person who's praying, or somebody's having a church service, or reading the scripture, or there's a prophet who maybe reminds people of something that God spoke in the past. There's nothing. It's just nothing, no mention of God. To the point that there are scholars of the Bible who say the book of Esther shouldn't even be in the Bible. It's because there's no mention of God. Why do we have this book in the Bible? Martin Luther actually said we should throw the book of Esther into the Elbe River because it doesn't belong in the Bible. He was quite convinced it shouldn't be in the Bible. And I'm wondering, maybe you're thinking this now as well, like, is that a mistake? Like, did the author of the book of Esther make a mistake to forget God? And maybe he wrote the book and at the end is like, oh, I forgot to mention God. What do? Oh, it's too late, I already wrote the story. You know, I actually think it's intentional. It's a bit of a literary device that he's using to make a point. Because this story finds itself in a setting where the Jewish people at the time, they actually were convinced that God had forgotten them, that God had he's gone. He's no longer with us. He's no longer part of us. They thought he had forgotten it. Have you noticed, can I just ask this, have you noticed there are moments in our lives where God is nowhere to be found? Anybody? Just me? No, come on. Yes? There are moments in our lives where it's like, God, where are you? Have you forgotten about me? I don't feel you. I don't sense you. I don't hear you right now. God, where are you? God, you seem invisible. It's easy to spot God and to recognize the work of God when he's performing miracles. It's harder to do this when he is invisible. Right? It's like, God, where are you right now? There's a theological term that I want us to learn over the weeks. It's the term providence. Maybe you've heard this word. Maybe you've even used it before. It's like, oh, this was quite providential, how something worked out. Providence, I think it's on the screen as well. Have we? Yes. It comes from the Latin word providentia, which means foresight. Here's a definition that maybe you want to write down. Providence is God sees to things before they happen. God sees to things before they happen. He's working in the background of what's happening in the foreground. That's what he's doing. In the book of Esther, we can see, even though God isn't mentioned, I believe we can see that God is pulling the strings behind the scenes. And it's quite fascinating to do that. He doesn't do that in a spectacular way, but in a very hidden way, an unseen way. And here's why I think this is important, because there are these moments in our lives where we think God is nowhere to be found. We need to learn, you and I, we need to learn to recognize God's providence in our lives when it's not so easy to spot, when it's not so spectacular and miraculous, you know? We need to learn how to do this. I think Esther can teach us. I believe that's why the book of Esther is in the Bible, because there are moments in our lives, like I said, where we can't trace God, but we can still trust God. Where we can't find God, but we can still have faith in God. Where God seems absent, but maybe he seems silent, but he is not absent. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah? So you interested? That's where we're going to go over the next few weeks. So let me give you a bit of the background of the story of the book of Esther, where we are in the history. So some of you may know, in the Old Testament, we read that the people of Israel, they were invaded by the Babylonians and were taken captive and were exiled and brought to Babylonia. Okay, far away from their homeland. That's where they lived for a couple generations at least. Right? 70 years? That's a couple generations. And then in 539 BC, the Babylonian Empire fell to the Persians. And the Persians took over. They were now the new player in the world. And to the Jewish people, the Persians were the liberators. They weren't nearly as oppressive as the Babylonians were. And in fact, the new Persian king, the ruler, he actually allowed the Jewish people to return back to their home country. That's when we read of guys like Nehemiah, who went back to rebuild the wall in Jerusalem, and Ezra and others, and they went back to build the temple and rebuild the entire city. And so most of the people that were in exile, they have actually gone back to the promised land, to the homeland. And there was only a few, like a remnant of Jews, who still lived in, like far away in Babylonia, what was now Persia. And about 50 years after the Persians took over, there was a new Persian king who assumed power, who was sitting on the throne, and that was Xerxes the Great. Xerxes the First, okay? Xerxes was a mighty ruler of this mighty empire. He was a fierce warrior. He fought great wars, especially with the Greek, with Leonidas. Anybody? No. Have you anybody watched 300? Yes? This is Sparta. Yeah? That one. I shouldn't officially recommend this movie because it's quite gory, but it's a really good movie. It's quite epic. So here's a picture of Xerxes, in case you wondered what he looked like, okay? He's talking with Leonidas, the Greek guy, and he's making him a peace offer. It's like, hey, you will live if you bow. And don't watch it, guys, but I love the movie. Anyways, that's Xerxes, okay? Xerxes' empire, it was vast. Let me just, because I looked it up this week, it went, the western side of the Persian Empire started at the Danube River in Serbia, all the way to India. That's east-west. And the north part was Odessa, the Ukrainian, just the south coast of Ukraine, all the way to Ethiopia. Okay, so it's a big kingdom. About almost half of the world's population at the time lived within that kingdom. So this guy had power. This guy was a ruler over loads of land and loads of people as well. And he was full of himself. Even in the movie, the way they portray him is also how historians talk about him. He saw himself as a god king. He thought he was actually divine. And we meet him, if you found now the book of Esther in your Bibles, okay, page 400 something, if that helps. We meet him in the book, in the first chapter of the book of Esther in verse 2. Let me just read this to you. It's also on your piece of paper, on your contact card, or here on the screen. It says here, at that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. The Susa is still a city. I think it's named something different now, but it's on the border of Iran and Iraq today. And it says, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. For a full 180 days. That's not a typo, guys. For a full 180 days, he displayed his vast wealth for his kingdom and the splendor and the glory of his majesty. Let me just pause right here. There are clubs in Berlin. They are quite proud of themselves because they open on a Friday and they party all weekend and they close on a Monday. And you can even, I have friends, they go on Sunday morning for the breakfast. You know, they just go clubbing. You know, it's like, and can I just say, compared to Xerxes' party, Berghain is a children's birthday party, okay? He partied for 180 days with his nobles, and the next verses, you can look it up, they're actually quite descriptive of even the golden sofas that they had, and how there was an endless supply of alcohol and wine. They were drinking, and it was wild, and there were no limits, and probably thousands of people celebrating for 6 months straight. And then it says in verse 10, on the last day of the feast, when King Xerxes was in high spirits because of the binging, he asked for Queen Vashti to be brought to him. Ooh, Vashti. Oh, Vashti, she was something with the royal crown on her head. Some translations say only the royal crown of her head, as if she had to come in dressed with nothing and display herself. For he wanted the nobles and all the other men to gaze on her beauty, for she was a very beautiful woman. So just picture this. It's an interesting story already, isn't it? Here is the Xerxes and his friends, and they've been partying, they've been drinking for 6 months straight, and now they're drunk, and he says, I have a great idea. Let me bring in my wife, and she should strip for us or something. Let's not entertain the thought too much in our heads, but it's just crass, okay? Here's what's happening with Xerxes. Now, before we continue, I want to pause here and actually ask a question that I believe everyone should be asking, especially every person who is somehow in leadership should be asking this question that I'm giving to you right now. Maybe you're thinking, oh, okay, that's not me. I'm not a leader. Let me actually summarize the word leader, the leadership, in one word, and it's the word influence. That's what we're going to be looking at in this week. We're going to talk a lot about leadership or how we steward our influence. You know, we need to think about not just how do we steward our affluence, our income, but also how do we steward our influence, our voice, and the impact that we can possibly have. And so maybe you're thinking, I'm not a leader, but wherever you have influence, whether it's at your workplace or your university or the playground or your home or your neighborhood, wherever you have an influence, you are a leader. You may not have a leadership title, but don't just think of leadership as titles or, salary. Think of your leadership as influence, okay? And for you to be a strong leader, you need to be asking yourself this question, and it's here on the screen. What's the purpose of my influence? What's the purpose of my influence? In other words, what do I want to achieve with the influence that I've been given? What's the purpose of my influence? Now, Xerxes, he had influence, didn't he? He was one of the mightiest men who ever lived on this planet. But I believe he misused his influence for the wrong purposes. He fell for what I call the 3 traps of leadership. The 3 traps, you need to know this, the 3 traps of leadership, and it was nearly his downfall. Why don't you write this down real quick? Here's where I believe Xerxes messed it up. First of all, he wanted to establish his platform. Do we have this? Yes. No? Next slide. He wanted to establish his platform. He wanted to be envied. He wanted to be feared. He wanted to be a somebody. He didn't throw this party just because he was so extremely generous, but he tried to win over the favor and the loyalty of the nobles. Remember we read that he was in the 3rd year of his reign. That means he was still quite new. He was in his mid-30s probably, and he tried to win the favor of the people. He tried to win them over. He wanted them to fear him. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing, Xerxes wanted to show off his possessions. He wanted to show off his possessions. The reason why this party lasted 180 days is because that's how long it took for Xerxes to show off and to brag with all of his wealth, to bring in all the treasure and all the livestock and all the slaves and everything that he had from all over the kingdom. That's how long it took to parade everything in front of the nobles. It's impressive, isn't it? The third thing is Xerxes wanted to feed his pleasure. He wanted to feed his pleasure. He was saying to himself, I don't just want to be envied because of my wealth. I want to be envied because my wife is so sexy. Right? And that was the turn on for him. For him to look at his wife, and, I'm sure if he would knew of Ed Sheeran, he would think, no, love with your body. He would just, Vashti was a sight to behold. And he wanted everybody to envy him. He was like, she's mine. That was, he wanted to feed his pleasure. Now, in this series, we're going to talk a lot about influence. But let me say this already up front. When God gives you influence, it's never for these things. The influence that you have been given is not so that you can build your brand, not so that you can blow your own horn, not so that you can blink at your crush, but so that you can change the world. Okay? Now, I want to ask you this question. When you look at these 3 things, platform, possessions, pleasure, can you just ask yourself this question? Which one might be a trap for you? Which one might be a trap for you? I'm just going to be straight up. For me, it's probably the first one. Like, popularity, that's a big one for me. My position is I'm a people pleaser, right? I want everybody to like me. I want to be a somebody, right? I've always struggled with this. Am I being too honest for you? I'm being real. I've always struggled with this. I know I'm aware of it. It's a bit of a shadow side of me, but I'm quite aware of it, but I'm struggling with it. This is definitely a trap. I don't want to fall into it, maybe like Xerxes did. The Bible says in 1 John in the New Testament, in 1 John chapter 2, up here on the screen as well, it says, for everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. I'm going to explain that in a moment. All these things, they come not from the Father, but they're actually from the Word. Now, it's interesting. The Apostle John here, he's writing already about the same values that Xerxes had 500 years earlier. And funny enough, 2,000 years after John wrote this, we still hype the same 3 things that he's talking about. Let me explain this. What are these things? The lust of the flesh, if you want to write this down, because you need to get this. The lust of the flesh is the desire to feel good. The desire to feel good. I want to feel good. I want to have I want to feed my senses, yeah? And in Berlin in 2022, there is this never-ending pursuit of pleasure and fun, and let's be free and let's be wild and let's just go all for it. And there are now taboos, and the city offers a million ways of how you can feed your physical appetite, right? And for many, that's actually the purpose of life. The purpose of my life is I want to feel good. But in the end, you might find yourself left with nothing, feeling emptier than ever before. You haven't actually fed your soul. You have wrecked your soul. And Xerxes, in many ways, he was like this as well. Like, he wanted to feed his physical appetite by getting Vashti to come in and dance for all the men. That's the first thing. The second thing is the lust of the eyes. That is the desire to have. The desire to have. If only I have that, then I will be happy, right? We play that game all the time, especially on social media, on our Instagram. Like, you look at each other's posts, and it's like, oh my goodness, can you believe this person is going on a holiday there? And like, Mateus, if you're watching, they're in Barcelona right now, right? Oh my goodness. Like, well, they're in Barcelona. Like, we play this game all the time. It's like, look what she's having for dinner, and look at his new toy. Whatever. You know, like, all the time we compare each other's stuff, and what we have is like, oh, I desire that. Or we like to show it off as well. Look what I have. Sometimes I make the mistake, because I live in Charlottenburg, sometimes I make the mistake and I walk around Kudamm. Don't ever go to Kudamm. It's such a... But there's all these guys and girls as well with their big cars. I don't mind people having big cars, but the way they try to show off their cars, like, that's just pathetic, really. They're like, oh, cool. You know, it's like, yeah. You know what I'm talking. It can be in all kinds of areas where we try to show off what we have. I think Xerxes, the lust of the eyes, Xerxes, he couldn't stop feeding his eyes on his possessions, on his wealth, and he loved to brag about it among his friends. The third thing is the pride of life, and that is the desire to be. I want to be someone. I want to be envied. I want to be recognized. I want to be praised. I want to be seen. And everybody in Berlin, we're all working on our, what I call the project self. Like, here's how I'm trying to establish myself in this city, professionally, relationally, socially, financially, all of these things. I'm trying to establish myself, and we're trying to compare with each other. We're trying to show off. Look at my resume. Look at what I've accomplished, and look how great I am. And am I good enough now? Do you see me? And we live in this elbow society where you almost have to push your way through if you want to be somebody. And there's people being left on the left and to the right, and we're playing this game all the time of, I want to be somebody, I want to be somebody. And Xerxes as well, he tried to establish himself. Now, these three things, the desire to feel good, there's a word for it, it's called hedonism. Maybe you've heard this. The desire to have is the word materialism. The desire to be is individualism. Okay? In other words, pleasure, possessions, position, or prestige, or platform, right? These three things, it's, by the way, every advertisement is geared towards one of these three things. Have you figured this out? Every ad that is being shown to you is like, hey, you need this, you will feel good. Hey, you need this, you can show it off to your friends, or you need her, she will make you feel good. You know, whatever, it's, every advertisement plays with your, with how you're wired in this way. And I think we're all wired in this way to pursue these things. They're nothing new. By the way, remember when Jesus was in the wilderness to pray and to fast? We read that he was tempted by the enemy. And the enemy came and tempted Jesus with the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. The same three things. The enemy came to Jesus and was like, hey, you've been fasting for many weeks now. Like, hey, here's some bread. This will make you feel good. Right? That's the first one. Or here are the kingdoms of this world. Do you want to have this? Then you are rich. Or do you want to be recognized? Do you want to be praised and celebrated? Do this little trick and you will be carried on angels' hands. Like, you will be so celebrated. He's playing with Jesus, and Jesus had to ask himself this very same question. What is the purpose of my being here? What is the purpose of my influence? Is it just so I can feed my own appetite in these three areas? And Jesus, thankfully, he said no to these temptations. He refused to use his influence for his own self. Jesus is a man, he's full of love and not full of lust. He's full of generosity, not full of greed. He's full of humility, not pride. Humility to the point that he even said, I did not come to be served, but to serve you. That's real leadership, by the way, servant leadership. Okay? I come to serve you and to give my life as a ransom for many. Maybe you know this verse. That Jesus, he chose self-sacrifice over self-obsession. It's remarkable. Xerxes, on the other hand, he was so full of himself, he was obsessed with pleasure, possessions, positions, and it almost ruined him. Let's continue with the story. You're still with me? Yes? Okay. In verse 12, we read, when the king's order was conveyed to Queen Vashti that she should come and basically expose herself to the party, she refused to come. That's big. She refused to come. She denied the request of the mightiest man on earth. And this made the king furious, and he burned with anger. Those of you who are married, would you agree that obviously having fights in a marriage, that's already bad. But when that fight happens in public, it's so embarrassing when other people can see like, oh my goodness, Dave and Jenny, you had a fight, but you're pastors. Like, of course we have fights all the time, right? Right? But when that happens in public, it's quite, it's so embarrassing. I wish people didn't know that side about us. And here we can see that, basically this was a marriage disagreement, a dispute, if you will, and it was embarrassing because the king had asked for Vashti to come and she said no. What a scandal. And so, again, remember, they're all quite drunk as well. So Xerxes, he goes to his advisors. You can read this in the story. He goes to his advisors and he says, what should I do with her? Right? And they're also quite drunk, but they have the wisdom, I guess, or they're thinking of themselves as well, and they're saying, Xerxes, this isn't just a problem for you, this is also a problem for us, because your wife disobeyed you, and now if our wives hear what your wife did to you, then our wives will not follow what we're saying at home either. Xerxes, this is going to spark a feminist revolution. We can't have that. We can't have that. And so they come to him and they say, you must now issue a decree that Queen Vashti be expelled from the palace. She must not come near you ever again. You must divorce her. And while you're writing this decree, can you also add, Xerxes, that all the wives in the kingdom should obey their husbands, right? And so that's what, Xerxes, he's saying, hey, great idea. I've been drinking for 6 months. Why don't I make a huge relationship decision right now? And so he goes for it. He issues this decree, and Vashti is being expelled from the palace. And he says all the wives in the kingdom, they must now obey their husbands. Now in chapter 2, we pick up the story again. And now we read that Xerxes is sober and his anger has cooled off, and he's now starting to think about what he's done to Vashti and to all the marriages in the land, and he's starting to regret his decision because he's starting to miss his wife, and maybe he's even singing again. Maybe I keep dancing on my own. Maybe that's him now, right? What a pathetic loser, Xerxes, really? Like, oh my God, he was miserable at the beginning of chapter 2, to the point that his advisors are looking into his chamber and just seeing him crying in his pillow. I don't know, but they're seeing him and they're like, oh my goodness, Xerxes is beside himself. He's lost it. And if he's lost it, we're all lost, right? Because we need him to function so the entire empire can function. And so what are we going to do? And well, one guy says Xerxes needs a new queen. Another woman who will make him happy again. And so they said, okay, let's find him a new queen. And so they launched the first ever beauty pageant in the history of humanity. Persia's Next Top Model, okay, was launched. And they say, hey, let's bring in all the most beautiful women from the entire empire, all the way from Serbia, from Ethiopia, from India, from Ukraine, and everywhere in between. We're going to bring in the most beautiful women in the empire so that Xerxes can choose a new queen for himself. And Xerxes was really excited about that plan. And now we meet Esther. Here's where we meet Esther. But Esther was a young Jewish orphan girl. She's been raised by her cousin, a man named Mordecai, who we'll come across again later in this series. And she apparently was a very beautiful young woman. And she also was brought to the king's harem. And if you look now on in verse 12, it's only here on the screen, it's not on your piece of paper. We can actually read a bit about the process that took place of how Xerxes was choosing his new queen. And it's a bit unreal, but let me just read this to you. This is the word of the Lord. It is. It's in the Bible. Before each young woman was taken to the king's bed, she was given the prescribed 12 months of beauty treatments, 6 months with oil of myrrh, followed by 6 months with special perfumes and ointments. Now, this meant 1 year of getting ready for one night with the king. And depending on how that night went, there were 3 possible outcomes. Outcome number 1, the king did not like the girl, which meant that she would, after the night, be sent back to the harem, not back home. She would stay at the palace, but she would never be called upon again. She would wait there to become a widow, because Xerxes eventually dies, and maybe then she would be free to go. She basically was forgotten. That was option number 1. Option number 2, the king liked her, and he took her as a, a concubine. Is that correct? Yeah, concubine, like as a side wife, that every now and then he would call her to spend a night with her. But if she ever has children, they're not heirs to the throne or anything. There's no expectations, just you're here for fun. Option number 3, the king falls in love with the woman, and he makes her queen, and she sits next to him on the throne, and her children are heirs to the throne. Those are the 3 options. It's quite a story, isn't it, guys? It's quite a story. And now these women are being brought from all over the kingdom. They're being brought to the palace. 1 year of beauty treatments. And then Xerxes starts to do his casting, his testing. I don't know how to better say it. And in verse 16 then, we read about Esther. Look at this on the screen. Esther was taken to King Xerxes at the royal palace in the early winter of the 7th year of his reign. Now remember, the party was in his 3rd year of the reign. This means it's now 4 years after the party, 4 years after Queen Vashti had already been expelled from the palace. Now it's Esther's turn. And it says, the king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. And then it also says, but Esther continued to keep her family background and her nationality, her Jewishness. She continued to keep that a secret. And now this orphan Jewish girl becomes the influential queen of the greatest empire at the face of the earth at that time. Here's where we're going to continue next week, how she used her influence. It's already quite a story. Let me wrap it up. Maybe you're saying, very fascinating story. Xerxes, what a freak. Vashti, quite impressed with her. But Esther, maybe you're saying, are we really going to study Esther for 4 weeks now? Because so far, I'm not impressed with her. So far, maybe she was very pretty, but did she have no self-respect? Like, she just gave herself to this beast of a king. Queen Vashti, maybe you're saying, yes, she was much more fascinating. She had influence. She had a voice. She stood up. She stood up for herself. She actually didn't play along with all these sick games that the king and his nobles had. So Queen Vashti, let's look at her a bit more, but we don't know anything else about Queen Vashti other than that she was expelled. So we don't have anything. But Esther, maybe you're saying, Esther, she was so compliant. She just played along. She was a Barbie doll who married this sex tyrant of a king. Really, are we going to study her now for 4 weeks? She even hides her Jewish identity. She's a coward. She's unlike Daniel and some other figures in the Old Testament who were also in Babylon and Persia, and they stood up for their faith and they were loyal to their God. But she's even making it a secret. She's playing along. She's eating the food she isn't supposed to eat. She's marrying a pagan, and she's breaking all the rules. Like, really, she's our role model now. And I just want to say to you, if you're reading the first 2 chapters of the book of Esther and you think, what's wrong with her? Why are we studying her? Why is God using her? What kind of woman is this? I don't want to read about her. If that's your reaction, then can I just say this? You may not have understood the message of the Bible then. Because you think the message of the Bible is that God blesses and saves people who are good, who have an impressive moral record, who actually abide by all the rules, who are examples to the rest of us. Those are the people that God can use. You think that's the message of the Bible. It's actually the opposite. The message of the Bible is the opposite of this, that God continuously and persistently and exclusively gives His grace to people who've never asked for it, who've never prayed about it, who've never deserved it, and who aren't even appreciating it when they receive it. That's the message of the Bible. It's all sheer grace. And maybe you're saying, yeah, Esther isn't impressive, and I would agree with you. I believe the story of Esther, she got off to a horrible start. It's a terrible start, that her parents died when she was a child. Now she finds herself in this city of Susa probably, and most of her countrymen have went back home, and she's part of the minority there, and now she's playing along this beauty pageant game with King Xerxes, and she's basically becoming his playmate, and she breaks all the rules. She's even hiding her faith. Really? But I tell you what's amazing. Over the course of this story, so be here over the next weeks, we will find that by the end of the story, she is a brave heart. She is a wise leader. She's a strong leader. And that means God has said, I'm going to work with her. I'm going to stay with her. I'm going to be patient with her. I'm going to use her. And in my providence, will work things out in a way that increases her influence bit by bit. I can work with this woman because I chose her and I love her and she's mine. Do you know what that means for you and for me? It means that no matter how badly you screwed up the beginning of your story, no matter what choices you've made that you aren't proud of, no matter what moves you had that you're really embarrassed by and you regret, all that, it means you cannot write yourself out of God's script for your life. Say it again. You cannot write yourself out of God's script for your life. He can still turn things around, turn bad things for good, and bring things to a happy end, even if it's all messed up, even if you've messed it up or circumstances have messed it up. God is not finished with you yet. You are not, no matter what happened in your life, you are not, hear me out, not disqualified for influence. Okay? Your mistakes don't erase calling. Some of you think, oh, I've disqualified myself for God to ever use me. Your mistakes don't erase calling. In God's garden of grace, even broken trees bear fruit. Okay? And you're never too far gone for His grace, which means there's nothing you can do where God will say, now you've messed it up too much. No more grace for you. No more influence for you. Now I'm going to take it all away from you. There's nothing you can do for God's grace to stop. It's an endless flow. It's an overflow that He has for your life. And if you feel like you've really messed up, if you feel like you've turned everything in your life into a fiasco, my message to you this morning is simply this: you can start over with God. You can have a fresh start with God. He's a God full of second chances. And maybe you're saying, I don't deserve a second chance. Let me tell you, you didn't deserve the first one either. It's why it's called grace, okay? It's why it's called grace. And so I don't care what you've done in your life. I don't care who you've done it with. I don't care how long you've done it. I want you to hear me. Your story is not over. Grace is there for you. And your story has just begun. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you that you're a God of providence who can work things out in our lives, even from behind the scenes. Thank you that you're a God who is full of grace, who will continue to give us grace upon grace upon grace. Thank you that you always have second chances for us. And we want to confess that just like Xerxes, we often pursue things in our lives that actually don't matter. We're running after these things and hoping that they will give us some kind of fulfillment, but they don't matter. So I pray, Lord, would you free us from these things? Would you help us to set our minds and our sights on things above and not on earthly things? Would you help us to steward our influence in such a way that it would glorify you and honor you and point to you? If there's anybody here and you say, I want to get to know this kind of God, would you just pray in your heart with me and then receive him in your heart today? That would be the best thing you can do all year in your life. You can just say, Jesus, I've messed it up as well. I'm so longing for a new start, a fresh start, a second chance. And as much as I know how right now, I want to turn to you. I heard today that you are the God of second chances, and I want to receive this grace, this second chance. Help me to understand this better. Help me to know what it means to follow you. Help me to figure out the things that you want to do in and through my life and through my influence. But as much as I know how right now, I'm going to say yes to you. Amen. Amen.